Welcome back to Air Quality Matters and my take on a paper or report on air quality, ventilation and the built environment. One take in that it's, in one take, and tries to summarise for you a scientific perspective on something interesting in, usually 10 minutes or less, because who has the time to read all these amazing documents, right? This week, I want to dive into a paper that I think is absolutely fascinating because it steps away from the physics and the chemistry of air that we usually talk about and steps firmly into the psychology of how we perceive the air around us. The paper is about why do we misperceive air pollution, a scoping review of key judgmental biases. And it was published recently in Air Quality, Atmosphere and Health. I'll put the links to it in the show notes as usual. And if I'm honest with you, it really got me thinking about why we struggle so much to communicate the risk of poor air quality, particularly in our homes. We often operate under this assumption, and I know I'm guilty of this too, that if we just provide people with the data, if we just show them the graph or the PM 2.5 reading, they'll change their behaviour. We assume that information equals action. But what this paper does is systematically dismantle that idea. It argues quite convincingly, I think, that our brains are essentially wired to misinterpret or even ignore the quality of the air that we breathe, regardless of the facts. The researchers conducted a massive scoping review of social science literature going back decades to identify the psychological mechanisms, or heuristics if you want the technical term, that cause this disconnect. And they identified 6 specific biases that I think anyone working in housing, ventilation or public health could probably do with understanding. I'm certainly going to think about it in the work that I do. So let's break them down. The first one is what they call sensory capacity. And this sounds a bit obvious, right? We rely on our eyes and our noses to tell us if we're safe when it comes to air quality. But the problem, as we discuss all the time on the podcast, is that the most dangerous stuff is often invisible or odourless. The paper points out that while we might see smog or haze when particulate levels are sky high outdoors, inside our homes, those visual cues just aren't there. We might smell something burning initially, and this leads to the second bias, we suffer from habituation. This is kind of nose blindness phenomenon. The paper highlights that while the evidence is a bit mixed for outdoor environments, inside the home, habituation is incredibly powerful. You walk into a room, you might smell damp or smoke, but 20 minutes later, it's gone. Your brain has decided it's not a threat and filters it out. And the danger there is that we stop perceiving the risk because the sensory input has stopped, even though the pollution levels haven't changed a bit. But where it gets really interesting for me is when they start talking about things like the halo effect. Now, this is a concept in psychology where our impression of one thing influences our opinion of another. In the context of air quality, this manifests as what they call the home halo effect. Essentially, people have a deeply held belief that their home is their sanctuary. It's safe, it's clean, it's my home. And because of that belief, they systematically underestimate the pollution levels inside their 4 walls compared to outdoors. The paper cites a study in Chile where 80%, that's 80, of people living in homes with objectively unhealthy levels of particulate matter perceived their indoor air quality to be good. Think about the implications of that for a second. If you're a house provider or a landlord and you walk into a property and tell a tenant that they need to improve ventilation because of the air pollutants, the odours, or it feels stuffy, you're fighting against a psychological wall that says, my home is safe. It's not just a lack of knowledge, it's a cognitive bias that protects their sense of security and sense of place. Tied very closely to this is confirmation bias. We actively seek out information that confirms what we already believe to be true or ignore what doesn't fit our narrative. So if I believe I live in a nice neighborhood or a good area, quote unquote, I'm going to downplay any evidence of pollution because pollution happens to somebody else in bad areas, not here. It's a way of reinforcing our social identity, but it blinds us to the reality of the air we're breathing. Then there's the exclusion effect, which I think is incredibly relevant right now with the cost of living crisis, for example. This bias suggests that when we have bigger, more immediate problems, paying the rent, putting food on our table, job security, our brains simply exclude air quality from our list of worries. It gets crowded out by the noise. The paper also touches on something called perceived benefits. If a source of pollution provides a benefit, like a job at a local factory or the warmth of a fire, we tend to downplay the risk. We trade off the long-term health risks for the short-term benefit, and we do it almost subconsciously. And that leads to the final and possibly most powerful bias they discussed, the effect heuristic. This is all about emotion. It's the gut feeling. The paper argues that our perception isn't just an analytical process, it's an emotional one. The classic example they use is the one we see all the time. It's the wood-burning stove. We know scientifically that burning wood releases significant amounts of particulate matter and other pollution, but emotionally, it's cozy, it's warm, it's family, it's nostalgia. That positive emotional response, that effect, overrides the cognitive understanding of the risk. We see the opposite with things we don't like. If there's an industry plant nearby that looks ugly and scary or intimidating, people will perceive the air quality as worse, even if, objectively, the measurements say it's fine. We feel the risk before we think about it. So what does all this mean? Why does this matter? Well, I think the so what here is huge. It suggests that our current approach to communication, which is largely based on deficit models, the idea that people just lack information, is flawed. We can't just put a sensor in a room, point to the red light, and expect people to behave differently, because these biases are working in the background to minimize that signal. If someone has a halo effect, they'll look at the red light and think that sensor is broken rather than their air is toxic. The authors of the paper suggest that we need to get much smarter about how we engage. We need to acknowledge these emotional connections. For example, if we want to tackle wood burning, we can't just scream pollution. We have to understand that we are attacking something people have an emotional attachment to. We need to offer alternatives that provide the same sense of comfort and emotional warmth without the emissions. They also suggest that while habituation is a problem, visible real-time data like visible sensors can help break through that nose blindness, provided it's presented in a way that doesn't cause fatigue or anxiety. It's a delicate balance. For me, the biggest takeaway from this paper is that we need to stop treating occupants like passive recipients of data. We have to understand the social and psychological context they live in. If we're going to deal with damp and mold, for instance, we have to recognize that telling someone to open a window might be fighting against an exclusion effect, where they are terrified of letting the heat out because they can't afford the bills in the first place. We might be fighting a confirmation bias, where they simply don't believe their behaviour is causing a problem or that their house is unhealthy in some way. It essentially tells us that to be effective engineers, consultants, or housing officers, we need to be part psychologists too. We need to understand that perception is not reality, but for the person living in that home, perception is their reality. And unless we bridge that gap, all the ventilation systems in the world aren't going to deliver the health outcomes we want. I'd highly recommend checking out this paper if you can. It's a great reminder that the technical solution is only half the battle. The human element, the messy, biased, emotional human element, is usually where the real challenge lies. That's it for this week's One Take. I hope this gives you a bit of food for thought for next time. And this is part 1 of a 5-part series looking at the psychology and perception of risk around air quality and ventilation. And as usual, a big thanks to our sponsors, Safe Traces and Imbiot. These podcasts simply would not be possible without their support. See you next time.